Hey, how's it going, everybody? This is another what if scenario, and this one is World Without the US Part 1. Now, personally, I think there's only two things you can do with the US. It's either one, you absolutely love it, or two, you absolutely hate it. Now, I love it, but many people would sadly disagree with me. Now, no one can deny whether you've been to the States or not, it's had a huge impact on the world. So let's find out what would have happened, how the world would have looked without the US.
When you're popular, everyone loves to hate you. And if you're American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that deserve being hated for. And if you're not American, then you should be able to admit that throughout history, the US has done things that it deserves being loved for. Yet, as the world's sole superpower, the US's influence spreads around the world, in both good and bad ways. What would happen, though, if the US didn't exist anymore? Or at least if its influence across the world stage disappeared overnight? World War II ends in a stalemate. Armchair historians love to point out that the moment Hitler invaded Russia, he was doomed to failure, and thus World War II would have been won by the Allies even without the US. Yet historical truth is not quite that simple. Invading Russia was a critical mistake made by Hitler, and one worsened when the US joined the war and reopened the Western Front in Europe. Yet, what if the US had simply shrugged its shoulders when Russia and Britain begged it to join the war effort? Despite a superior fleet, Britain's war material supply was running dangerously low, even with constant American resupply efforts. Without the US to ship war goods to Britain, the best that the United Kingdom could have done is stave off a German invasion. In war games carried out in the early 2000s by a British think tank, it was discovered that Hitler could never have successfully overcome Britain's fleets, the RAF, or the Home Guard in a cross-channel invasion. Yet this war game was undertaken with constant US resupply efforts underway. Without these resupply efforts, a cross-channel invasion would probably still have been disastrous for Germany, but then again, Germany would have had little need to invade Britain without the US supplying it. A token defensive force could have been left behind in France in order to discourage British invasion, and the full might of the Wehrmacht could have been dispatched to the Eastern Front. Not just reviled as a madman and mass murderer, Stalin was also famously a very poor strategic thinker. He was so surprised by Hitler's invasion that in the years leading up to it, he had taken almost zero precautions against German hostility. To make matters worse, his political purges prior to World War II had decimated the ranks of the Red Army and eliminated most of its experienced commanders. Despite having exponentially greater numbers and firepower advantage in the Winter War of 1939 against Finland, the smaller and much more poorly equipped Finnish army managed to absolutely decimate the Red Army before overwhelming numbers alone forced a defeat. By the time of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, little had improved in the Red Army in the way of command and control, logistical support, or even training. When Hitler invaded, his troops quickly seized many of the Soviet Union's agricultural regions, leaving.
By the way, I find it strange. Why exactly does he start with World War II? I mean, obviously the States has existed for much longer, so interesting take.
The nation to face mass starvation if it hadn't been for the US's Lend-Lease aid program to the wartime allies, providing food, raw materials, tanks, planes, ammunition, clothing, and everything in between. The United States provided critical aid to the Soviet Union in its most desperate hour. American raw materials fueled Soviet factories that churned out tanks, and thousands of Studebaker trucks helped move goods around the nation and its troops to the front lines. Warm winter clothing kept Soviet soldiers from freezing to death, and American rations fed both soldiers and civilians alike. As Soviet General Georgy Zhukov said after World War II, "We didn't have explosives, gunpowder. We didn't have anything to charge our rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with their gunpowder and explosives. And how much sheet steel they gave us. How could we have produced our tanks without American steel? But now they make it seem as if we had an abundance of all that. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." Immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the United States gave the nation an interest-free loan of $1 billion, or about $17.5 billion in today's dollars, worth of supplies and raw materials. The United Kingdom was also given an initial lease of between 40 and 50 destroyers. Per the terms of the Lend-Lease, the materials were lent for the duration of the war and expected to be returned or reimbursed only upon war's end if they were kept for civilian use. Any combat losses would not be expected to be repaid. Basically, the US lent the Allies surplus military equipment under the condition that that it didn't have to be repaid for unless it was kept after the war was over. In total, the US gave the Soviet Union 44,000 Jeeps, 375,883 trucks, 8,071 tractors, 12,700 tanks, 1,541,590 blankets, 331,066 liters of alcohol, 15,417,000 pairs of military boots, 106,893 tons of cotton, 2,670,000 tons of petroleum products and fuel, and
literally never heard this before. That's crazy.
And 4,478,000 tons of food. It's clear that without the US, the best the Allies could have hoped for would have been a stalemate, with Germany holding on to the richest parts of the Soviet Union and expelling Britain off the mainland. No European Union. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, Europe found itself in shambles. Nearly all of its financial and industrial networks had been destroyed in the fierce fighting, and entire national economies had collapsed. The war had been the most devastating in human history, and the fate of entire nations hung by a thread. 2.5 years after the end of fighting, there was very little sign of recovery from the European mainland, with millions of homeless and out of work. Then, in 1948, the U.S. Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, drafted up a 4-year plan meant to reinvigorate the European economy. The plan would rely on $15 billion of financial aid, or $250 billion in today's dollars, and it would be completely financed by the American taxpayer. The first target of the Marshall Plan, as it came to be known, would be feeding the European population, as a massive famine was threatening the mainland. Thus, food aid was immediately dispatched to 16 European nations. The Soviet Union and its satellite states had been offered assistance as well, but it had turned it down due to fears of meddling by the US in internal affairs. The main focus of the Marshall Plan was on the recovery of Europe's largest industrial powers, such as West Germany, France, and Great Britain, as it was believed that if these great economies were jump-started, then the effects would spread to other nations. Attempts to rebuild national shipping fleets, road and railway infrastructure, and reconstruct devastated cities were bolstered by American aid money, though the effect of the Marshall Plan is likely less economic and more political. Due to the Soviet Union's refusal to partake in any reconstruction efforts, the Marshall Plan and the 16 nations it aided helped establish the political framework for what post-World War II Europe would look like, with the West firmly aligned in solidarity against the Communist East. The Marshall Plan seeded the idea of European unity and fostered an intertwining of European interests, which was President Truman's greatest goals, as only a unified Europe could stand against the Soviet Union. But also, only a unified Europe could avert another world war. Without the Marshall Plan, European economies would have taken longer to recover than they did.
What, actually Denmark was annexed by Russia? Is that true? I mean, Finland seems to be neutral and Sweden is neutral. Sweden is neutral. Norway seems to be on the European side, but then I've never heard that Denmark? Shit.
Which would have made them more vulnerable to political revolutions fostered by the Soviet Union, whose agents were constantly at work attempting to make the ideology of Soviet revolution abroad or of spreading communist revolutions around the world a reality. The Marshall Plan, however, also laid down the political and economic roots for what would become the European Union. And without it, it's very likely that Europe would have returned to the old power way of thinking that had dominated European politics for centuries. European colonialism prevails. Prior to World War II, European powers retained colonies across the world, and upon entering the Second World War, President Roosevelt made it extremely clear to the Allies that America's help was dependent on the eventual liberation of the majority of these colonial holdings. With their feet to the fire, Britain and France were forced to agree, and after the end of the war, President Truman made it a top priority to ensure that Britain and France, as well as other European powers, held true to their promises to begin liberating their colonies. Though the process was slow, the end of colonialism was much the result of the
you can actually just see stuff getting dropped in the bag. What the hell?
economic collapse of Europe's great powers, as it was the sheer determination of American presidents to see Europe relinquish its old ways. Without the United States, European colonialism would have continued, and may in fact have worsened. With their economies in shambles, European powers would have leaned even harder on their colonial states, bleeding their economies dry in an effort to rebuild themselves. This would have sparked violent insurgencies around the world, which would have brought with them harsh crackdowns by the colonial powers. In the end, the death of European colonialism would have taken decades more to arrive, and the world today may in fact look a lot more like it did during the age of the great powers. Korea unified under the North, and Japan rises as an imperial power once more. Today, South Korea is a vibrant and prosperous nation, while its
Korea unified, are you sure about that?
neighbor to the north is facing mass starvation and economic desolation. Yet the entire Korean peninsula would look very different today if it were not for the US. 2 days after the start of the war, the UN published Resolution 83, urging UN members to lend military aid to the South. A UN coalition force was ultimately formed, but it was the US that would do the heavy lifting. The war would end 3 years later after China's involvement, with the US not desiring to see the situation evolve into another major war that would now include China. If the US had not been available to defend the South, the war would have been won by the North far too quickly for the UN to marshal a sizable military response, and the entire peninsula would have been reunited under the North. Communism would have overtaken the South, and while we may be tempted to compare the fate of a communist peninsula with that shared by the North today, it's important to remember that the state of the North's economy is largely the result of US-led sanction efforts against the Kim regime. Without the US to lead these sanctions,
Yeah, but you act like they're doing great things in the North. Seriously, what the hell?
and under the protection of a growing China, the unified Korean peninsula would be in a stronger economic state than the North is today. If it would have been more prosperous than South Korea is today is debatable, but what isn't is that a communist Korea wouldn't necessarily be as impoverished as the North is today. A communist Korea would have naturally gravitated toward China, and
It might not be as poor or as poor as today's North, but seriously also not great. Just because if something's bad and something's less bad, that doesn't mean that the one that's less bad is good in general. You know what I mean?
and become a satellite state. This would have upended Asian politics as we understand them today. Japan, for one, would have been quick to ditch its pacifist ideologies, which were only ever truly possible as a result of Japan enjoying the protection of the United States. Faced with a hostile China, Japanese nationalistic hardliners would have upended the constitution and rewritten it to allow Japan to once more field a military capable of both offensive and defensive operations. Even today, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is a member of a right-wing nationalistic party, which in the past advocated a return to imperial power. Japan would have risen as a military power once more, and conflict in Asia would be all but unavoidable. The second half of the 20th century would have been dramatically different without US intervention, and it's likely that communism would have dominated the global stage both militarily and politically, whereas today we live in a world of mostly strong democratic states. We could in fact have seen a reverse of this, with the world as we know it being made up of a collection of communist states where the democracies are the minority. What would that have meant for global civil rights movements? We can only guess, but in part 2, we'll take a look at how the world may have looked as it entered the 21st century in a world without the US. What do you think?
Honestly, I thought that he would have a different take on it. I think he would start somewhere else. I mean, obviously the World War II had a significant impact on world history, but at the same time, I mean, the US has existed since, hundreds of years. I mean, you know what I mean, 200-300 years. But even stuff was happening before, so I don't know why he didn't start the Declaration of Independence, somewhere around that. Why did it have to be World War II? Sure, but even until then, the US had an impact on everything. And then there was also World War I. I mean, you could argue, why didn't he start with World War? If he started with World War II, why couldn't he also start with World War I? Because that's also where US came in. So, interesting take. Definitely don't agree with everything he said, especially the North and South Korean part. So it's what it is. But overall, great video. I'm gonna definitely watch part 2 in case you guys are interested. Guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if there's any other videos you would like me to react to, definitely put the name of the video down in the description. And I'll go check it out. Guys, appreciate every single one of you. Take care. Bye-bye.